Hello and welcome to another episode of This Much is True Crime with me, Martin Frizzell, and my esteemed colleague, friend, Emeritus Professor of Criminology, David Wilson.
Well, it's nice to see you again. And as you know, I do like the esteemed, I like the emeritus. All those things are wonderful.
Which is why when we met before we came into the studio, having a cup of coffee, I thought, who's this kind of, character, in advancing years, clearly desperate to keep trim because you walked into the local coffee shop in a pair of shorts.
Well, as you very
This
well
is middle of
know,
October.
I know it's
Are you a
mid-October,
postman or something?
but I'll keep wearing my shorts until it's almost impossible and possibly cold not to. And as you know, I've just finished a tour. And so there's a sense in which I feel slightly giddy and reclaiming my life. And because I'm more comfortable in shorts rather than the kind of stage outfit I was wearing, I felt I'll come and see my friend Martin wearing my shorts. And all I get is criticism.
Very fetching, very fetching. So I'd advise you maybe if you're, there's a choice on Spotify, you can listen to audio or you can watch it. Maybe just switch the vision off for a bit.
Are you going to say anybody with a nervous disposition? You're making it sound like Netflix's latest episode of Monster.
That was last week, and that's done very well. Actually, if you haven't heard it or seen it yet, then please catch up on our latest episode, which was all about that. But this week we are talking again incredibly serious, which is pretty much all the stuff that we do is serious. But this is a question: how safe are the monsters or other high-profile people in jail, coming off the back of the murder of Ian Watkins, who is the lead singer with the Welsh band the Lostprophets, serving 29 years for quite honestly heinous crimes, including the attempted rape of a baby. He was sentenced and went to jail 12 years ago. And this week he was murdered by, well, we don't know yet. It's allegedly. There's two men who have been arrested and charged with murder, but murdered in prison he was, certainly, we can say that. For me, David, we'll come to talk about other people. I say good riddance.
You mean it's a social good that we have vigilante justice, and it doesn't matter where the vigilante justice takes place, in prison or in the community.
Yeah, it's natural justice. I mean, I read, if you go through, and I suggest people don't because it's just, you feel you have to go for a shower after it. I went through the judge's summing up as he was working out what tariff to give this man to put him in jail. And also the two women who gave up their children for this character to abuse them in the most horrible of ways. And what he was doing with children, it was just quite frankly, it was, I'd say it's evil. I know you don't like the word evil. I'd say it was evil. It was not of human behavior I've ever heard or seen and hope never see again. But quite frankly, how he lasted 12 years in jail is a good innings because he would be a marked man as soon as he was banged up.
Well, I don't disagree with your characterization of the kinds of crimes that he had committed. And I perfectly accept that what he did was beyond the pale. What I think we're disagreeing about is the idea that you are sent to prison and can just be forgotten about. It's the law of the jungle inside. I've always used that aphorism, Martin. You're sent to prison as a punishment, not for punishment. And prison is an institution of the state. And the state, therefore, has an approach about how prisoners should be safe, and their punishment and the institution, prison, that's meant to deliver that punishment is that you serve a period of time behind bars. Now, just simply accepting that a prisoner could be murdered or even attacked by another, and Watkins had been attacked repeatedly in Wakefield. This isn't the first time he'd been attacked. For me, one of the things that never happens as a result of these incidents is a scandal. Nobody gets really upset about the fact that the state, which has a responsibility to ensure the safety of people inside, doesn't deliver on that. And indeed, it was my research a few years ago that pointed out that the murder rate in prison was often higher than the murder rate in the community. I mean, that is a scandalous state of affairs for a state institution, it seems to me.
You won't get much public backing for that thought, though, will you?
Oh, nobody, it doesn't create a
Nobody
scandal.
cares because, quite
Nobody
frankly,
cares.
they're evil, best done away with.
And look at how HMP Wakefield, Watkins was murdered in HMP Wakefield. Look how HMP Wakefield is known. It's known to the tabloids as Monster Mansion. Nobody particularly wants to recognize that these are still people that are locked up in these institutions. They have done the most appalling things often, but you can't simply have vigilante justice. These people are going to be sent behind bars and it's a free-for-all. Try and kill them as soon as you can. That would be wrong.
Wakefield seems to have a particular problem. Its most recent report, very recent, just a few months ago, is that levels of violence there are increasing quite considerably. It's a very dangerous place with Category A prisoners, including people at Watkins and others. I understand, maybe I'm wrong, or maybe it's just a apocryphal story, but the word nonce, which prisoners use to describe a paedophile or someone who's been found guilty of child sex abuse, was born in Wakefield, suggesting it was on the cards you put on cell doors. And the acronym NONCE was not on normal courtyard exercise. They had to be kept away.
Now, there are a number. I mean, that's a perfectly feasible derivation for the slang nonce, a sex offender, not just a paedophile, but a sex offender. And but I tend to trust my friend, Noel Razor Smith, on this, who's actually...
Noel Razors.
Noel Razor Smith, who was once Britain's most prolific bank robber, but he turned his life around through psychotherapy at HMP Grendon. And he wrote a number of best-selling books, including a best-selling book on prison slang. And he says that the derivation of the term nonce comes from simply a shortening of nonsense. This was a nonsense crime that these men committed, and therefore over time nonsense got shorted to nonce. So it could very well be an acronym, but there are a number of different derivations. Whether those explanations are accurate or inaccurate, there is nonetheless always a prison hierarchy. And at the top of the hierarchy are armed robbers, blaggers. And at the bottom of that hierarchy are sex offenders. And whether you're a famous sex offender like Watkins, that might bring its own issues. You are at the bottom of the hierarchy as far as prison is concerned.
Would you say that, and it'd only be human nature, I suppose, that there would be some prison officers who would turn a blind eye to abuse of sex offenders?
Oh, not only turn a blind eye, perhaps also encourage the abuse of sex offenders or of rapists or others. We've talked a wee bit about prison officer corruption in earlier episodes of the pod. And equally, one of the things that really worries me is that prison officer training has been reduced from many months to 4 weeks in some cases. You can be exercising authority on the landings literally a month after you applied and are accepted to become a prison officer. That to me is not a great state of affairs because, of course, that opens up that individual to be corrupted.
It's estimated, or it's fact, the figures, it's almost 20%, I think it's 18% of inmates in jails in England and Wales are in there for some sexual offence or other. And that's a lot of people with targets on their backs. Now, you take Wakefield out of the equation because it's a mix of people in there, but you put in something like Little Hay, which is specifically pretty much 95%, they're all sexual offenders. And from what I was reading, the level of violence in there is nowhere near what it would be in a regular prison like Wakefield.
So you're right. And when I started as a prison governor sex offenders were encouraged to go what was called on the rule. And in those days, it was Rule 43. That would allow you to be segregated from prisoners who had committed non-sexual offences. And many sex offenders exercised that right. And then there were so many sex offenders that eventually you couldn't just have a wing of a prison dedicated to looking after those prisoners. You had to have whole prisons dealing with those prisoners. And the hope was in the prison service, certainly in the 1980s and 1990s, that you could work with sex offenders through the sex offender treatment program to actually try and challenge what it was that was encouraging them to commit crime against children, against women, against boys, against men. Now, sadly, that kind of treatment program proved utterly disastrous. It actually encouraged sex offenders to become worse sex offenders, and the government tried to suppress the results of that research for a number of years, but it's now in the public domain.
How did it make them want, how did it encourage them?
Well, it encouraged them because they started to learn how to fake empathy. It encouraged them to, they understood that they had to say that they were sorry, but they didn't feel that they were sorry at all. And because they were in groups talking about their sexual offences, they were listening to other sex offenders discuss the sex offences that they had committed. And so it became this bizarre kind of support network for how to commit sexual offences. So it actually escalated their offending behaviour rather than de-escalated it.
Because these are, I mean, they're obviously devious people, very smart as well, aren't they? People think you're a sex offender, down on your luck. I mean, clearly, you know, this is such a wrong thing. You must have known what you were doing was wrong. But these are quite smart, intelligent folk.
Yeah, and you know, the stereotype of the sex offender being a dirty old man in a raincoat who's going to flash at kids on their way to school, you know, probably still happens, but that's not what sexual offenders are really like. Sex offenders are very, especially if they're going to target children, are very adept at finding where they will be able to gain access to children and the ability to abuse them. So again, probably in my day, your day, there were always pedophiles who attached themselves to boarding schools. Now you find a lot of pedophiles who recognize that boarding schools more generally, have a number of safeguarding requirements that are attached to the recruitment of new staff. You see a lot of sex offenders targeting sports, becoming, you know, coaches in sports. And some sports are very good at recognizing that they've got to take safeguarding steps in terms of qualified coaches. But there have been scandals about swimming, there are scandals about gymnastics, and so forth and so forth.
Well, as the the American coach from one of the US Olympic teams who was convicted of abuse of, you know, those in his charge. And in fact, I think he was also attacked in an American jail as well. So it's not just this country that has those problems. But aside from or including sex offenders, famous people who are in jail. Now, you're a former prison governor. What is done to, I mean, is there anything done to separate them, to protect them from, and why would another inmate want to cause them harm? Would that just be for notoriety for themselves or because they have a grudge against them?
Well, it could be for a variety of reasons. But to take your first question, what is done to protect them? Well, quite clearly there would be a frank discussion with somebody that came in who had a level of celebrity and depending on the crime that they had committed. But if that celebrity had committed sexual offences, especially sex offences against children, there would be a frank discussion with that person about they probably needed to be segregated away from the main prison population. Now, living in segregation is not the easiest thing, especially if you have got a long sentence. So gradually you would try to get a much more normal life for that particular prisoner behind bars. But celebrities have got a number of advantages, haven't they? And disadvantages. Celebrities, again, depending on the offense that they've committed, have influence, have fans, have money. The celebrities can trade on that celebrity to buy protection whilst they're inside. And so there's a variety of things that they can do that is going to make them safer. Sometimes, though, the celebrity will have a target on their back, again, depending on the crime that they've committed, because there will be some prisoners who think that by tackling that celebrity, they will gain from tackling that celebrity their own inverted infamy from the fact that they cut that celebrity or attack that celebrity or put that celebrity in hospital. Not a sex offender, of course, but I do remember the different tactics used when Jeffrey Archer went to prison. Went to prison, of course, for perjury, not for sex offences. But Jeffrey Archer wrote a really interesting triumvirate of books about his life inside. But it was quite clear he used his wealth to protect him. He literally bought protection. Jonathan Aitken, somebody I know well, who also went to former cabinet minister in the Conservative government, who again was going to be convicted of perjury, I think. He goes to prison. He doesn't use his money and wealth so much. He's had a much shorter sentence. What he did was made himself useful. He very much took prison on almost as if it was a constituency. He was running constituency meetings, so he would write letters. He would advocate. He would explain. He would write letters to bureaucracies that might be able to support. And Jonathan ultimately is going to find faith in prison and is now an ordained Church of England priest. So some celebrities have used different forms of tactics to keep themselves safe whilst they're inside.
And of course, there will be inmates, and some of their reasons for attacking these high-profile, especially sex offenders, as we came and mentioned right at the start, is almost like their form of karma, their form of natural justice. I mean, is there such a thing as honor amongst thieves, that, you know, there's a proper way of doing things in society and life? Yeah, I may be wrong. Maybe I did an armed robbery, but I didn't fiddle with children. And if you do that, you know, you're a wrong'un and we're going to have you.
Yes, this hierarchy of heinousness runs through prison subculture. And there will be that kind of, well, they deserve what they get. And the courts won't give them that, but I'll give them that. And that's where your earlier question, can sometimes prison officers turn a blind eye to that kind of behavior? Yes, of course they can. And what you've got to come back to is that prison is an institution of the state, and the state has to determine the level of punishment that's meted out, and that punishment is formally sanctioned. It can't be a vigilante justice, whether it's in the community or whether it takes place behind bars.
I think Watkins as well may have tried to, as you were saying, you know, you find a way to protect yourself. I think he was using, I was reading that he was using, and he still received fan mail, quite a lot of fan mail in jail through his years. He was using other inmates to somehow make money out of the pen letters that are being sent in to him to send back. So he was actually, I presume, trying to protect himself by surrounding himself with other inmates who may get a benefit from his fame, which would then, I would suggest, made him last those 12 years, because, you know, quite honestly, that's a long time. When you read what he was guilty of, that's a long time still to survive, having had all that on your card. And it just made me think as well, apart from him, there's another inmate, probably the most famous, apart from Jimmy Savile, the most famous paedophile that I can remember is Gary Glitter.
Yeah.
Now, he seems to have survived.
Well, firstly, he survived in the Far East, in Asian prisons, didn't he? He was in prison in Thailand. One of the guests we've had on the pod before, Graham Hill, interviewed at length Gary Glitter prior to Glitter coming back. He was actually called Paul Gadd, coming back to this country. But in the Thai prisons, Gadd survived quite comfortably by using the tactic of being a Westerner, by having access to money, by being able to buy himself protection. When he comes back, I'm not so sure where he got sent to. But you raise a very, very interesting point, because Watkins was still receiving fan mail. And one of the things that we've been discussing is ultimately the sexual abuse of children. And we should not have any doubt that the sexual abuse of children is widespread in the community. And it's a very small number of people that are going to be convicted of sexually abusing children. And the fact that Watkins was still receiving fan mail was because many people in the community would also be rather enjoying the fact of what he had done when he was in the community himself. You know, the sexual abuse of children is pervasive. And that's really why people like Watkins could still retain an audience and a fan base even after the crimes he had committed.
There was talk as well that, in those letters, he was also grooming from prison. He was grooming someone, a woman with a child.
Yeah. Yeah. And
listen. So, hang on, you're a former prison governor. Is no one reading these letters? Is no one opening them?
Yeah.
Is no one sort of managing what's going on in this? And bear in mind, he went to jail showing no remorse.
Yeah.
The judge was very clear about that. Is no one actually saying this is a dangerous individual here who's still, his tentacles can still spread? He sold almost 4 million albums, lots of fans, a lot of them women.
And that's part of the point I'm making. Let's not pretend that we're locking up all the pedophiles in the community, because we're simply not. We're scratching the surface of that kind of offender. Would his letters be read? Yeah. Would his telephone calls be monitored? Yeah.
And he smuggled in a phone. He had a phone which he was
there. You go.
Sentenced to extra 10 months for.
And would his visits, when he gets people to visit him, would a prison officer be standing over him, listening to everything that was being said? No. And then we're back to the institution of prison, and what happens in our prisons so rarely creates any interest at all. And it certainly isn't going to create a scandal. And actually, you mentioned earlier the Chief Inspector of Prisons report about HMP Wakefield, and he said that the levels of violence in the prison had increased. Memory will get me, but I think it was 67%. He said the levels of violence since he had last attended, the levels of violence had gone up by 67%. Nobody cares. That's my point I keep making about our prisons. They never create a scandal. And that, for me, in itself, is scandalous.
In the last year in England and Wales, 400 deaths, almost 400 deaths in prison. You're right, it's a 37% increase
37.
Across the prison estate. Now, 7 of those were murders.
Mm-hmm.
That's still shocking. But almost 100 took their own lives, suicide. And that seems to remain steady through the years as they go on, which is shocking. And again, does that come down to poor management? Or is that, people being, quite frankly, other inmates encouraging them to do it? Where do we go with that in terms of how do you bring those numbers down? Or again, I hate to say it, but do people care if it's an inmate who's in for a serious offence? Do people care?
No. And if you think about it, people don't care. And I can give you an example in which, at the highest possible level, David Blunkett, on receiving news that the serial killer Harold Shipman had committed suicide, also in HMP Wakefield. Now, David Blunkett, I thought, was a very decent Home Secretary. But when David Blunkett was given the news on the morning that it was discovered that Harold Shipman had hanged himself, said, and it got reported in the papers, he said, "Is it too early to open a bottle of champagne?" So if you've got the actual Home Secretary saying it's a win-win, we're no longer paying for this man to be locked up, and he's a horrible serial killer. That kind of attitude prevails. So, what can you do about those attitudes? For me, it's always about opening up prisons. Prisons are very secretive places. Those high prison walls don't just keep the prisoners inside, they keep the public gaze away from.
But Wakefield had an observational documentary on it, so we saw inside Wakefield.
Occasionally, the prison service press office will allow a very curated version of what's happening inside a jail, but it's not that realistic. I mean, it's a very kind of, curated experience for the viewer to see. I just feel that the public should, it's almost back to the Dickens day when Charles Dickens wanted to go into a prison. He would pay to go and see what's happening inside. I don't mind that. I really don't. I think if it's an institution of state, we, the taxpayer, pay for the continuance of that institution. And I think inviting the public in to see what's done in their name is a good thing. Creating connections between the community and prisons is, for me, really important. And rather than kind of locking it up and nobody ever sees it, so nobody ever cares, that for me is the beginning of challenging the culture around it. Then it's about staff training. Then it's about prison management, saying that you, prison officers, I want you to have achieved these kinds of objectives, and really being firm about what's being delivered inside. And that's what the Chief Inspector's report, the unannounced inspection report that was done just a few months before Watkins was murdered, that's what the Chief Inspector's report was saying. What we expected to see here isn't actually happening.
The suicide rate, the high rate in England and Wales, is mirrored in America as well. They've got similar problems, which did make me think again, as it's still a live issue, Epstein and the conspiracy. Was it suicide? Did someone else do it? That kind of thing. And they obviously took it so seriously that Ghislaine Maxwell, just after the Epstein suicide, she was put on at-risk watch. She was made to wear paper clothes. Mm-hmm. She was woken up every 15 minutes with a searchlight to make sure she was still alive.
Yeah.
So at some point they took it seriously, but clearly not seriously enough that Epstein either committed suicide or someone helped him commit suicide.
Let me segue back to Epstein in a second, but a 15-minute watch is what would happen in this country too. If somebody was believed to be very close to committing suicide, they could be placed on a 15-minute watch. But then on the other,
every 3 days, someone's dying from it, someone's killing themselves.
Because you can kill yourself within 15 minutes. If you are watched on minute 1 and then the officer returns on minute 16 to see how you are, you could have taken your own life. If somebody's really determined to kill themselves, they will be able to achieve that objective. Epstein, of course, is back in the papers today because of Virginia Giuffre's autobiography, which has just been published, in which she reveals again a catalogue of extraordinary statements, both about Epstein and about Prince Andrew. I'm still waiting. One of the things that's great about the podcast is that you get a lot of reaction to things that we've said. And I pointed out that Epstein, the missing minute of tape, was absolutely meaningless for me. And I still believe that there has been no conspiracy to kill Jeffrey Epstein, and that he took his own life when he was not sharing a cell, when he should have been sharing a cell, and when he was not being watched as he should have been watched by the guards in that particular prison.
But the conspiracy, as you say, rumbles on to the point where Donald Trump, does he get the Nobel Peace Prize? Who knows, for bringing peace, albeit for the time being, peace in the Middle East. The conspiracy theorists are still suggesting that, yes, the reason why he's gone so big on that is because he is so scared of what's still to come out about Epstein.
Well, that might be true. I mean, that might indeed be true. And you've got to remember that Trump did say that the Epstein files should all be released, and they haven't been. And who does that annoy the most? That actually seems to annoy the MAGA fan base that he has more than anybody else, because they're saying, hang on a minute, we voted for you because we wanted you to release everything about Jeffrey Epstein, partly, I think, because they believed that a lot of the Democrats would be swept up in the conspiracy. But, who knows? All I know is, using my knowledge as a criminologist, Jeffrey Epstein did not, there was no conspiracy to kill Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein took his own life.
I think we'll be talking about it forever, won't we? Yeah. But just going back to the Trump thing then, so Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been accused of war crimes,
Yeah.
if that ever comes to court, who knows? But say it did, for instance, Milosevic was another one, the Serbian leader. Those are characters, especially someone like Netanyahu. Where would you be able to keep him in a jail and be safe? Because clearly there's a whole tranche of people, I imagine Islamists, Arabs, who, are absolutely against what Netanyahu has done. How could you ever keep someone like that safe?
Well, you mentioned Milosevic. Remember, Milosevic is going to actually go to prison, and he was in prison in The Hague because, of course, it was the International Criminal Court that tried him. I thought it was interesting that Netanyahu, when he flew to the United States to meet with Trump, had to avoid airspace on that journey of several countries who had said, we are treating Netanyahu as a war criminal. And of course, there are some countries who sign up to the International Convention on Human Rights, which would end up in a tribunal. And of course, the United States doesn't. And that's one of the reasons why.
But I presume if he was ever sent to jail, it would be an amazing, probably, I'd have thought, he's not going to be sitting there in a bare cell with a toilet pan in the corner, is he? Those kind of people, they'd have quite a nice life in jail.
No. He would be sitting in a typical prison, dealing with his sentence like anybody else. The only prisoner that I kind of think, and the only reason I know this is because he took the Norwegian penal system to the European Court of Human Rights, was Anders Behring Breivik. All I know about Breivik's sentence,
He's the one who killed all the children on the island.
Utoya. He kills 77 people, the white Christian fundamentalist, and sets bombs off in Oslo, then rushes off wearing a policeman's uniform to Utoya Island, where there's a youth conference taking place, and he shoots all the kids. Anders Behring Breivik, the worst mass murderer in Norwegian history, he got the maximum penalty that Norway can pass on somebody, which is 21 years. And of course, he's been in solitary confinement. And he has two cells. He has a cell where he can use the intranet, and a cell where he can sleep and so forth. He took the Norwegians to court, saying that was inhuman treatment, because, of course, he was so often by himself. And I did think, well, that's a bit rich, isn't it? And he was complaining about moisturizer in one of his petitions as well. He couldn't get hand moisturizer. But there you've got this sense in which I come from a very kind of liberal tradition. I'm like, we have to have the appropriate things done once you have been convicted, because you're sent to prison as a punishment, not for punishment. But even my liberalism, Martin, has a point at which I'm not prepared to go beyond.
And also, when you think of the victims, and often, or most times, the victims aren't thought about.
No.
We think about the heinous crimes and, who's done it. We don't really talk about the scarring, the physical and the mental scarring of the victims of people like Ian Watkins, those children growing up, what he did to them. Yeah. I mean, that's where, you can be as liberal as you like, but they will be grateful that what could be called natural justice has run its course.
And I understand that. I do genuinely understand that. And the argument that I'm making is probably one that isn't going to create a great deal of support. But nonetheless, I think it's an argument that we should be making. I think it's also important to say, because I wrote a book about pedophiles and pedophilia, and it was called Innocence Betrayed. And when I was finishing the book, I thought I've got to have some positive thing to say about what we can do with pedophiles. And the best that I came up with was something called Circles of Support and Accountability in Canada. That movement, Circles, is now in the UK. It's called Circles UK. And if people really wanted to find a way of finding a way of reducing the numbers of victims of children in our community, then volunteering for Circles UK would be a very good thing indeed. And if they didn't want to go that way, then there's the wonderful Lucy Faithfull Foundation, which again does tremendous work in trying to stop kids falling victim to these terrible offenders.
Some good positive things to finish on. Apart from, just finally, so Watkins obviously connected to music in a big way. Millions of albums sold. Gary Glitter connected to music in the 70s. Lots of hits.
Jimmy Savile?
Many number ones. Jimmy Savile. Michael Jackson, never found guilty of anything as such. A lot of money changed hands with some of his young friends, but never found guilty of anything. But again, one of the world's biggest, if not the world's biggest artist at the time, and maybe still is. Psychologically, are we wrong to still listen, maybe ethically or morally, to listen to their music?
Can you separate the art from the artist? Would it be possible to listen to Wagner and still not associate him with Nazism? Would it?
For many years, Michael Jackson wasn't on playlists, and now it is coming back in.
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up in the 70s. I love Gary Glitter, but I would feel very guilty about listening to a Gary Glitter track.
I think it is still possible to separate the art from the artist. And I know that the artist has been tainted, but nonetheless, if the art transcends the person who has created it, I personally would not have a problem with that. I think your broader point, though, is if you're constantly surrounded by young people who are your fans, Michael Jackson, Gary Glitter, Ian Watkins, Jimmy Savile even as a DJ, then the temptations are even greater there, aren't there? You don't really have to try very hard if you're sexually interested in children to be able to get a group of young people that you can groom and then abuse. So I think that's an important cultural point that you're making. But I think the broader art point is, for me, I think it is possible to separate the art from the artist and still enjoy the art, whatever form that art takes, whether it be traditional paintings, opera, classical music, or indeed popular music.
I take your point on that. I still won't be listening to Gary Glitter.
I can't believe that you liked Gary Glitter.
I'll be playing it loud. I was listening to discos in the 70s. It was great music. It was clever music of the time. It worked very well. And of course, in The Joker, one of the films a few years ago, they deliberately used it, and I presume provocatively, to illustrate what was going on in that movie. I remember being in the cinema, and I didn't know this was coming, and he's coming down a set of steps, dressed as the Joker. And there was, I was like, not just me, a gasp in the cinema from people who hadn't heard that song for 30 years or more.
Oh, which one was it? Do you want to be in my gang?
It was something like that, yes, yeah. Well, they all kind of sound the same, don't they? But it was that, like, gosh, you've actually used it, but provocatively, I think. I mean, it's not as if the filmmakers didn't know what they were doing. Of course they did.
Yeah.
But it had the effect of just how kind of twisted this character was, and to play it in there. But maybe for another day, and maybe we should get someone in who could actually sort of take the opposing view to you in a big way, saying that we shouldn't, we should basically sort of write them out of history, these people, which would be a shame because some of that music was good. But for the time being, Professor, thank you very much for that.
Well, always.
Till we meet again, maybe you'll have some clothes on.
Well, I'll try the next time, but I kind of, every time I do the podcast, I take away just another little bit of Martin Frizzell's life, elocution lessons, and now a fan of Gary Glitter's music in the 1970s.
A rich tapestry. Till the next time.
Next time.